All right, thank you so much. Your emotions are actually contagious. You probably know that to some degree or another. I can think of times where I've gone to a funeral and it was someone I knew, someone I cared about, but not somebody I was particularly close to. And I'm not normally a big crier, so it wasn't the kind of situation where I was going to be sobbing the whole time. But wouldn't you know it, you get there and the whole atmosphere is sadness and sobbing, and you've got family members reflecting on their lost loved one, and you can see the grief in their face and the tears welling up, and before you know it, you start crying, right? And you're like, oh, this is, and you weren't prepared for that, right? Because emotions are contagious in that way. I can think of times with my 5-year-old son where he said or did something that wasn't appropriate, so it was time to, put on stern dad face and say, son, that we don't do that. But he's laughing hysterically because he thinks he is hilarious. And what happens? My face breaks and I start laughing hysterically with him, because that joy in his face, that happiness, it overcomes, my duty in that moment. And so I have to get past it and snap out of it and put the stern dad face back on in order to do my job in that point. But we know that if you're in an atmosphere where there's happiness, you're going to be happy. If you're in a place where there's praise and celebration, you're moved to want to praise and celebrate. And if you're in an environment where there's a lot of depression or despair or anxiety or something like that, all of that can affect the way that we feel. And I think about Christmas time and how that even happens with the music we sing. Isn't that interesting that songs that were composed hundreds of years ago still have this emotive power in our lives? And we've heard them thousands of times over the years, and yet we come back and they create warm feelings in our heart and excitement and stir our imaginations. Why is that? Are the songs we just sang, powerful in that way because they were so beautifully composed? Well, of course, that's part of it. They're really good songs, but I think it's because the best of them flowed from hearts that were just overcome with praise in their own lives. They were so grateful and so inspired by the story of God giving Jesus Christ to his people 2,000 years ago that spilled over in their composition of these songs. And that's why that continues to have power over us and can be a source that God uses to create joy in our hearts during this season. And I know that that's part of it for one very interesting reason. A couple years ago, you can look this up. I'm not making this up. The first time I read this, I had to do a double take. An atheist lady produced a Christmas album called the Atheist Christmas Album. Now, that sounds like an oxymoron to me, right? Like atheists and like Christ, Christmas, right? Atheists, okay, how do those two go together? But her rationale was, well, the reason why we like to sing these songs in the winter is because the winter months get dark and it's cold and we feel depressed and we're stuck inside and we need some more vitamin D than we're able to get from the sun during that time of year. And so all cultures sing winter songs, and I grew up on those tunes. I'm not a believer in Jesus anymore, but I still like to sing them, but I can't sing them in good conscience as an atheist and sing about Jesus and angels and the virgin birth and things like that, because I don't believe in that stuff. So what she did was she took the tunes and kind of scrubbed them of all their religious content and wrote in nice secular lyrics in their place. And guess what? Even though she's a gifted singer, they're awful. They are not good at all. My favorite Christmas song is "Oh Holy Night." And you get that first climax where fall on your knees and hear the angel voices. And you literally just want to fall on your knees and sing praises to God for the wonder of that. And she observed that, lyrics and their music are composed together. And so, you can't just add any lyrics into it. You've got to match them. And she says, you can't replace the word fall there. It has to be fall. So fall has to stay there, but what's going to fall? Well, her solution, instead of fall on your knees and hear the angel voices, and she doesn't believe in angels' voices and doesn't want to fall on her knees in reverence to a deity, it's fall flakes of snow. That doesn't do it, right? There's nothing majestic or awe-inspiring or joy-evoking about that, right? It just doesn't do it. The reason why that song has that power at that point is because it comes from a person whose heart was overfilled with joy and wonder at the thought of the fact that God gave us himself when he gave us his son 2,000 years ago. And so whether we like it or not, whether we realize it or not, the way that we feel affects the way that other people feel. And the way that we respond to God at Christmas time and always, it's going to shape and affect and impact the way others in the world, those in our sphere of influence and beyond, respond to God. There's just no way of avoiding that. If you show up to church and you go through the motions and you're just sort of indifferent and uninspired by it, there's no reason to think that people around you are gonna feel a sense of joy and wonder and curiosity even about who Jesus is and what Christmas really means. But when we join together and our hearts are just filled with gratitude, as we see in this passage that we're going to be looking at here today, that overflows and makes us want to sing, that inspires us to sing, that compels us to sing praises to God, where we find in him and no longer in things that everybody else is looking for joy, but we find our joy in God as we know him in Jesus Christ. That is infectious. That will spread through our church community, and it will leak out of these walls into the community outside. It will change the way you relate to people you work with. It will be noticed in your family life outside of the church. It has power. Your emotions and your response to God are contagious. They will affect things. And that's what this text, I think, is all about for us. And that's what the Christmas story is all about. We've been talking about the ways that the Christmas story is supposed to create new responses year after year and to remind us how we're supposed to engage God because of the good work that he's done for us. And the first sermon was going to be about hope and how because God answered the hope of the people of the Old Testament by giving the Lord Jesus, we look back at that and realize that God was faithful and that he was good, and we look forward to Christ's second coming with hope, which is not just a blind leap of faith, but the expectation and trust that he's going to do what he said he would do because he already did what he said he would do once. And then we talked about faithfulness and how even though God may ask the extraordinary from us, he promises to be faithful, and we lean on his goodness, and even when we can't see it, we grit our teeth and we trust in him and we walk in obedience because of his faithfulness and providing. We saw this in the story of the Virgin Mary and caring for her in her desperation as her being chosen to carry the Son of God would have likely had very, very devastating consequences for her socially. And then last week we talked about peace. We talked about that as the alleviation of what afflicts us mentally and emotionally, but also the restoration of the whole world that is marked by conflict and chaos and disorder, and how we are called to long for that peace even while we experience a taste of it already as followers of Jesus. And today, I think we're going to get to something of the climax of it as we look at the book of Isaiah, which is a really fascinating text. That we're looking at here in chapter 12. And it challenges us to find joy as we look back at the deliverance that God gave us when he sent his son, our King, the Messiah, the Lord Jesus Christ. They were looking forward to the Christmas story in the text that we're looking at, but they look forward to it and celebrate it as though it's already happened. And so we can connect with it by now looking back at it because it has already happened. And that creates in us, if we're doing this right and we're engaging with it correctly, a response of joy and a delight and a satisfaction in God already, even while we're still longing for the ultimate and most full realization of that. We have an overwhelming and overflowing joy that comes from engaging with God, knowing him through Christ, that both impels us, it floods into us, it enters into the core of who we are, and it compels us. It moves us to singing songs of praise and declaring and proclaiming his goodness to anybody who will give us a hearing. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I see 3 points in this text that I think we need to make. The first is that this is a joy that is for salvation. That's in verses 1 through 3. It's a response to salvation. In verses 4 to 6, it's a joy that proclaims. So it responds by sharing that joy with others. It's not a joy that stays in here, but that flows out. And lastly, we'll see the call to pursue joy, and we'll talk about what that means. Let's look first, though, at joy for salvation. As I said, that's in verses 1 through 3. Excuse me one second. This section of Isaiah, chapters 11 and 12, forms sort of like a climax. It's the closing of the very first section of the book. And if you go back to chapter 11, it's the final prophecy in a series of prophecy that promises that God is going to give the Messiah. The Messiah was going to be an anointed king who would manifest God's presence to his people and deliver them from all their enemies. They were constantly at war and in conflict, and ultimately their sin had led them to the point where God, in order to be truthful and honest and trustworthy, was going to have to let his people go into the judgment of exile. But the text promises that God was always going to redeem them from that. He was always going to send them this king and deliver them even from themselves, eradicating their sin, forgiving them, and bringing them into a new creation. And chapter 12, therefore, is sort of like the song that the people of God would sing in response to this once this has happened. And again, it looks forward to God showing up through this glorious king. So that's why it says in that day. It's looking forward to that future day, both in verse 1 and verse 4. And he says, I will praise you, Lord. Verse 1, although you were angry with me, your anger has turned away and you have comforted me. And the idea here is that God's justice required that he not turn a blind eye to the sin of his people. They were in a covenant relationship with him. They were responsible to reflect on him well in the world. And what they had done through their sin was dragged his name through the mud. And so his wrath is good. His wrath is just. They're not faulting him for being angry with them, but they're giving thanks to him because in his goodness, not only was he rightly angry with them, but he chose to make a way to turn his anger away. And so now they experience forgiveness. He's no longer angry with them. The text says, you have comforted me. God is no longer a cause for their fear because of their sin, but he's now a cause of comfort, a cause of joy, a warming presence that they can rely on for goodness. And that is because, as verse 2 says, surely God is my salvation. And so the text goes on to talk about how they're no longer afraid. They don't fear God's wrath. They don't relate to him as one who's rightly angry with him and promises to bring out a sentence against them. No, that's been dealt with. It's been done away with. The Lord has become my salvation. And the text says, again, verse 2, starting in the middle there, the Lord himself is my strength and my defense. Again, he has become my salvation. He's delivered his people, and he continues to preserve and protect him. This state of his anger against him is never going to come back again. He's done away with it once and for all, and he becomes an invigorating and empowering presence for them and a protecting force in their lives. And I want to focus especially here on verse 3, because this is their response to it. Their response to this saving work, this forgiving work, this new comforting presence of God is verse 3, with joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. Now, I don't know if anybody in this room has ever had to survive with water from a well before. Has anybody? Yes, okay. I thought some of my brothers over there would know exactly what we're talking about. I don't know what we're talking about with this. I've always had running water where I've lived. But I know people who haven't always had running water where they lived. And so they'd have to make a trek to a well to draw out water to live, to cook, to drink, to clean themselves, whatever it took. But this here is an image that's even more dire than that. This is like we've been living in a desert, the desert of God's judgment, and we've gone days without water, and we're on the verge of death. And if I don't find water soon, I am surely going to just dry up and waste away in this desert. And then you stumble onto an oasis, and now you have an unlimited supply of water. And what do you do when you get to that water? Do you taste a little and walk away? Or do you jump in and gorge yourself on that water and swear that you're never going to leave that very spot? You never, ever want to experience a situation again where you're desperately in need of what has just satisfied you, and the water is cool and it's crisp, and as soon as it touches your lips, you know that you are going to be okay. And that's their response to God here. That's the response that I have now partaken of the wells of his salvation, and I want to keep on partaking of the wells of his salvation. I'm going to keep drawing from that water. I'm going to keep on enjoying the refreshment and that life-giving property of water that I've found nowhere else. And it's not just salvation that they're thankful for in terms of that work that God did, but if you back up, the Lord himself is their salvation, right? So they're not just thankful for the nice stuff that God did for them in the past. They're thankful for God himself. He has become my comfort. He is my salvation. I know him. He is the water in that well. I am drinking deeply of him. He has become my delight. He is what I need. He is what I want. He satisfies me. He preserves me. He enables me to thrive. That's the response of recognizing that God himself has come for his people. We'll come back to that. But it's not a joy that stays in here. As I said, it floods out from us. And that happens in at least two ways in verses 4 through 6. It's through our praise, our singing, or our worship, what we all just did together, but then also through what we might call our outreach and in our desire and longing to go and proclaim this goodness to the nations, to those who do not believe. Looking at the first point, verse 4, he says, give praise to the Lord and proclaim his name. Verse 5, sing to the Lord, for he has done glorious things. Verse 6, shout aloud and sing for joy, people of Zion. You may wonder sometimes, or maybe you haven't wondered, I'm inviting you to wonder, why do we sing songs to God? Why do we do that? Maybe for you, the quickest answer is, well, that's just sort of what I've always done. I've always gone to church and we always sang songs, and so I expect that we're going to do that when I go. So it's just sort of tradition or rhythm or something like that. You've never thought about why. Why is that the way of expressing joy in God, right? Or maybe you might think that, well, it's just a matter of duty, right? So I sing songs to God because I know that I'm supposed to, because I realize he's God and I'm not. I call Jesus Lord, and so out of a sense of duty, I do it, but I'm never really all that inspired to do it, right? I'm sort of just flowing down the lazy river of attendance and being there, and my lips move, but it's not out of a compulsion of love for God that's flowing from my heart. I do it because I'm supposed to do it, and if you're not feeling it, I'm not saying stop singing, but there's supposed to be more to it than that. Our singing to God, if it's really going to give him honor and glory, ought to be motivated by more than tradition and more than a sense of duty. And I'm going to borrow an illustration from a pastor named John Piper, who's been a big influence on my life and my way of thinking, especially with this issue of joy. And so say that I were to surprise my wife with a nice piece of jewelry and like a romantic poem that I wrote, right? And let me tell you, this doesn't happen nearly often enough, so I'm probably, like digging my own grave by even using this illustration. But so I do that, right? And I hand it to her, and she opens the box, and her face lights up, and she says, wow, thank you. And she reads this nice poem, and she says, wow, that's really nice. And I say, babe, it's my job. It's my duty. Had to do it. Is she going to feel honored? Is she going to feel good about that? Does she feel any sense of real love or gratitude about all that she does for me in that? Well, imagine it went like this. I hand it to her, her face lights up, and she says, wow, thank you. It's not even a special occasion, thank you. And I say, well, babe, I stop and I look at you, and sometimes I get stuck because you are just so beautiful that I cannot believe you're married to me. And just when I see you come in the room, I see you mother our children, and I experience the good things of life with you. My heart is just overflowing with joy. I just can't help it. I love you so much, and I wanted to see that look on your face. That's going to get a different response, right? That's going to go a lot further. And again, I'm not afraid to use a sermon illustration for brownie points in my marriage either. Now, but that's the nature of our response to God, right? Is this awe and wonder. He's so glorious. He's so beautiful. He's so awe-inspiring. He's so delightful. And it is stunning that he wants to be with people like me, that he wants to give his best to me, that he comes and he gives his son who dies in my stead, and he blesses me, and he provides all that I need. That is what's supposed to motivate my joy. How can we not be moved with gratitude? How can our hearts not overflow with words of praise for that? Right? That's what's supposed to be moving us. That's what the Christmas story invites us to be inspired to do. And when we experience something that amazing, we don't keep it to ourselves, right? We share it with other people. And that's our other point, that it leads us to reach out. The text talks about proclaiming God's name. And I'm not a big movie buff, right? So I don't go to the movie theater very often, but when I do, it's usually because somebody who is a trusted movie buff, who's a good, amateur film critic, says, that's an awesome movie. You need to go see that. It's by this director and blah, blah. I don't know directors, but movie buffs know directors. And so I take it on good authority that it's worthwhile to go and see that movie, right? Because they were compelled by it. They shared that with me, and that made me want to see what was going on. What I am more compelled by is like a really awesome cheeseburger. If I go to a new restaurant and I order a cheeseburger and it's just like a party in my mouth, just life-changing, the next time somebody says they're hungry, I'm going to be like, dude, you have got to go there and have this epic cheeseburger. It will change your life, and you won't ever want a cheeseburger from anywhere else ever again, because that it had impacted me, right? It gave me joy. It satisfied me in the way that nothing else had. And so I can't help but go and share that. And so if we're not moved by our experience of God like that, then the question has to be, do we really grasp the significance of that? Do we appreciate the tremendous condescension of that, right? Like I get told I'm married up all the time, okay? And I'm good with that, all right? It's better than the other way. Like, dude, you really compromised. No. I get told I'm married up, and I am good with that, right? But that's like nothing compared to God's condescension in having a relationship with me, right? It doesn't even compare. So how are we not moved to take this good news, the wonder that Christmas causes in our hearts, to show that God became a baby, to come and give his presence to us, and ultimately to die in our stead so that we could have newness of life? And how does that not overflow in our praise and leak out in our proclamation of this to everybody who we can have an opportunity to share it with? That's what this text is telling us is supposed to be our response, that kind of joy. It's not just a joy that gets my heart pumping, but a joy that moves me, a joy that compels me, a joy that shapes what I do. And verse 6 is the whole sermon in one sentence. And you said, well, Robert, if you could do the whole sermon in one sentence, and, okay, well, sorry. Verse 6 is the whole sermon in one sentence. Shout aloud and sing for joy, people of Zion, for great is the Holy One of Israel among you. Great is the Holy One of Israel among you. We esteem God as great, and we know him as great because he is with us now. You'll hear the echoes of the Christmas passages that we read year after year in Matthew chapter 1, which quotes Isaiah 7:14, that the virgin would conceive and give birth to a son, and you would call him Emmanuel, which is God with us. Because Jesus came, we now have that thing, that person who is more valuable, more delightful, more awe-inspiring, more moving, more compelling than anything that we can imagine. Great is the Holy One among you. Great is the Holy One among you. And that's what we're called to fight to feel. We're called to pursue joy because of that. And I mean this in two ways when I talk about the pursuit of joy. One is that it's our duty to fight ferociously for joy in our lives. If we don't feel joy, we're to fight for it. I'm going to come back to that. And second, we pursue joy by sharing joy so that other people experience joy, so that there's joy in the Lord everywhere we look. We're like walking around and tripping over God's joy. That's what it means to pursue joy. And as I said, the idea of fighting for joy probably sounds odd. It's the holiday season, so that's like saying you need to fight for the love of eggnog, right? Either you love it, like me, or you don't, and you need to repent, right? It's that sort of thing. But you think like, how can I make myself love eggnog? And how can I make myself experience joy in God? And of course, the two aren't absolutely comparable, right? Like the more you try something, probably the less you like it. But God is different with that. The more we press into him, the more we drink from the wells of that salvation, the more we concentrate on delighting in him and focusing on him, making him our treasure, making him our priority, letting his plans, his agenda determine what I do and don't do, the more I understand what it means to have joy, the more I experience that joy. And this means for you, for me, for all of us, if our Christian lives aren't characterized by a sense of joy, then there's something that's distracting us or hindering us, that God is being overshadowed by something in your life that's robbing you of what's really valuable, of what really has worth, of what's really inspiring and compelling. And it means that it's your duty to fight for joy by being honest and identifying whatever that is and deciding that you're going to make war with it. That's the language Paul uses in Romans chapter 8. He says, put to death what is worldly in you, right? He says, and if we don't, it will kill us, actually. He says this in a number of places, not just Romans 8. So that's part of the application. Are you struggling this time of year to realize as you're listening to this message that you're supposed to be moved to have joy with God? That's not always easy, right? I'm not trying to shame anybody here because I'm somebody who struggles to find the fullest joy that I know I'm supposed to have in God. And usually when that becomes harder, it's because I'm distracted by some sin in my life, whether it's pride or it's greed or anything like that. It comes in and it takes my focus away from pursuing satisfaction in him. So fight for it. Fight for it. And when you have it, sing about it. Give God praises for it. That moves you along in joy, right? Gather with other people who have God as their joy. Our joy will be contagious. And if you're around people who don't delight in God, there's little chance that you are going to move properly in that direction, right? But also be a person who proclaims that joy to others. If you're passionate about the satisfaction that is yours because God sent his son, Jesus Christ, then you should be trying to share that satisfaction with other people. Maybe you're here and you've never known that. Like what you're hearing, like that sounds interesting, but I have no idea how to relate to God in that way. I've never looked to Jesus and looked to him longing and desiring for satisfaction. I feel like I'm in that desert you're talking about. I want to invite you today, if it's the first time that you've ever done that, or if it's the 100th time you've ever done that, to turn your gaze upon Jesus. We've been reflecting on that story of his humble coming in a manger, bringing salvation and light and peace to the world. I want to invite you to turn to him. Turn to him by praying to God and saying, God, I'm not satisfied, and I need that. I'm being held back and I'm being weighed down. I feel like I'm living in a desert and I might die if I don't have the waters from the wells of your salvation, which is life with you, God. I want to invite you to say that prayer right now in the quietness of your hearts or with me afterwards for the first time, for the 100th time, and to go on a relentless pursuit of growing up and learning all that means. If that's not you, if you have trusted in Jesus in that way, and you do trust in him, I want to invite this church to live up to this call, this sense of overwhelming joy, of embracing that and treasuring that and delighting in that so much that it shapes our pursuit. Inside this church, as we seek to have joy together, as we seek to celebrate God's work among us, among this people, but also as we seek to be instruments of bringing joy to the world, right? Outside of these walls, as we engage our family members who don't know Jesus, and we share with them about the joy, and they will know it if it's real. They will know it if it's our pursuit and if it's our delight. If we're really drinking deeply from the wells of salvation in joy, those around us will know it. And they need to see it, but they need to hear it as well. We need to proclaim it. Why are you so filled with joy? How is it that you respond to that tragedy in your life with such hope? You say, well, God gave me Jesus. And when he gave me Jesus, he gave me himself. He held nothing back from me. He's my source of joy. And I suffer like you. I hurt like you. But I press into that all-satisfying power that is the knowledge of God in Jesus Christ. We have opportunity, especially this time of year when people are thinking about Jesus, to share joy with them. I want us to all be challenged to experience that in our hearts and to be agents of helping others to experience that as well. Let's pray together. Our Father, help us in our unbelief. Help us in our doubt. Help us when we're distracted. Help us when our eyes have gone after that which cannot give life, have gone after a water that doesn't hydrate, food that doesn't fill, instead of coming to you, Lord. Help us to be a people who are honest with ourselves and who are tenacious in the pursuit of joy in you, willing to destroy whatever hinders that. Lord, help us to be a people that treasure one another because of the joy that we can all have together, knowing and pursuing Jesus as a community. And help us to be a people who delight in it so much that we pursue it relentlessly. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.